All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the DevSecOps Expert AMA Roundtable. We're joined by several wonderful people spanning Chef Software and ShuttleOps. We're just going to give it a couple minutes for people to join and get comfortable, and then we will get started. So please just give us a couple minutes for attendees to join, and we'll get things started. For those joining, we're just giving it a couple minutes for attendees to join. Welcome to the DevSecOps Expert AMA Roundtable. We'll get going in just a few minutes. Thanks again for those that have joined. We're going to get going in just about 1 minute's time. Welcome to the DevSecOps Expert AMA Roundtable. For those that are joining, I'd encourage you to go and look at the Q&A section of the Zoom controls. We will be monitoring that throughout the course of today's discussion. We also have a couple of polls that we will be interjecting into the conversation. And for those that did submit questions in advance, we'll make sure to get to those as well. Thanks for your patience. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining the DevSecOps Expert AMA Roundtable. We're very excited to have you. As you can see, we've got 6 people spanning 2 different companies, both Chef Software and ShuttleOps, joining us today. The point of this conversation is to be very free form, very interactive. We've got a couple of polls that we'll interject throughout the course of today's discussion. Also, for those that submitted questions in advance, I'll be filtering those into our experts to get answers for you throughout the course of the call. I'd also just like to point out to everybody the Q&A function of the Zoom software. If you engage that window, you have the ability to ask us at any time, anonymous or otherwise, any questions you might have based on how the conversation develops, or any questions you didn't have an opportunity to submit in advance. So with that, we're going to do a quick round of introductions, and I'm going to turn it over to our expert panel. And I think we should probably go in order by how these beautiful faces are listed here. So Dave, we'll start with you.
Well, if you're starting with me, then it shouldn't be the order of beautiful faces, but thanks, Jason. I guess my name is Dave Found. I'm the Vice President of Product Development at ShuttleOps, and so yeah, we're just looking forward to, talking through a few of the ongoing activities when it comes to DevSecOps, try to lend some knowledge and explore some things with you today.
Thank you, Suraj.
Yes. Yep, that'd be me next. So my name is Suraj Rauf. I'm a DevOps specialist also at ShuttleOps. So working with a lot of DevOps tools, consulting, that involves some application development and just kind of, architecting deployments in the cloud, trying to make use of new agile features while keeping security at the forefront of, customer concerns. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Ryan.
Yeah, my name is Ryan Bonner. As you can see, I have the same title as Suraj. We both work at ShuttleOps and do a lot of consulting around Chef products, which are heavily integrated with our own platform called ShuttleOps. So yeah, a bit of a mixed bag.
Cool. Matt.
Yeah, I'm Matt Rock. I'm an engineer on the Habitat team at Chef. My main role is making Habitat a good experience on Windows. I was involved in getting it working on Windows, and now I kind of oversee maintaining it and working kind of on the Windows ecosystem. Yeah, that's it for me.
Cool. And then Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric Libreta. I'm a lead solutions architect for Chef. I spent the past 3 or 4 years out in the field with customers working on Chef and Habitat projects.
All right, and last but certainly not least, Jody.
Hey y'all, I'm Jody Wolfborn. I'm a senior developer advocate at Chef. And basically what I do is help bridge the gap between people using products out in the field, doing the DevOps things, and our internal mechanisms. So product, marketing, all that kind of stuff, and make sure developer voices get heard.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for those introductions. So I'm going to kind of start with like a pretty interesting question to lead y'all off to get the conversation going. But certainly, DevSecOps are all about, efficiency, gaining more security, and certainly here in I'll use this loaded term, uncertain times. We've had to sort of face new realities and new questions. So if you were looking back at 2020, now that we're more than halfway in, maybe what are some of the biggest learnings you've had about DevSecOps this year? And what are maybe some of the aha moments you've had about how it can impact businesses? Go.
I'll kick off. I got my beautiful face in there first, so let me take one. I think one of the biggest things is not even about technology or tools or even really people. There's a huge need for process and asynchronous process. The entire world just got shifted into a work from home model, and many companies not exactly ready for that. And it's just kind of thrust upon them, and some organizations thrive, some have not. And where we see the kind of the challenge and the opportunity for growth and enablement is ensuring that asynchronous communication is up to speed, so that you can still collaborate remotely, whether you're spread across the world or just down the street kind of thing. I think that's a huge interruption. And when it comes to DevSecOps, you need all of your teams to be kind of on the same page at all times, and that you really lose that that being in the same room together or the same offices together. If that was the only way you were keeping on the same page, you've lost that. And so you really need to get your asynchronous communication kind of down pat.
What else? Thoughts?
Yeah, I think building on that, being flexible and open to different experiences than you might have had before is like one of the biggest lessons I've taken out of 2020 so far. Yeah, all the uncertainty that's happening right now is causing a lot of important changes, I think. And so like even just in technology alone, if you ignore everything else, technology is being affected by this, exactly how Dave is saying. Like the asynchronous communication, all of this stuff becomes so important. So like being flexible and having the ability to say, well, I might not have done it this way before, but I can try doing it this way moving forward is super important.
Any other thoughts on that? What have you seen people sort of like stall out pursuing sort of DevSecOps strategies, or have you seen it kind of accelerate?
I think it's just a general trend of being overwhelmed with the number of options you have out there. So often the solution to that, or at least as it was for me, coming from sort of a traditional infrastructure background, is I had the convenience of having real things to do at a company like ShuttleOps, but picking something and diving into it is really, there's really no substitute for that when you're confronted with this type of shift, right? So it's important that you're willing to give it a go, and it's important to realize that there's people, many of which are on this call, that are willing to help you do that. So yeah, in my opinion, just throw yourself into it and get started, right?
Yeah.
I think continuing off that same point, I think it's very interesting and very telling that both Jody and Dave didn't mention technologies. And like, I think Ryan was continuing into that, but it seems interesting that the same pattern I feel like we were seeing over the last year of we've had a lot of tools in DevOps and DevSecOps, and we've found a lot of creative ways to use them. Some have become more specialized, some like we've backed off of in terms of certain use cases. And what I've seen a lot of in the last year and what has accelerated recently is we're kind of learning the boundaries for those tools. Like, when should you use something and why are you actually using it? Like, what value do you actually derive from that? Because I know even in our personal experience, sometimes we've learned to use a tool and we found that it does certain things that are maybe convenient. But we'll find that like over time, it may have gotten in the way of other things such as like visibility in terms of like being able to have like communication between teams. Actually, a very simple example of this might be like we used a lot of Terraform in the past, and things such as like you can play so much variable like Lego, where you can pull in variables from different modules and stuff. And something that we were really interested in the last 2 years was Terraform remote states. And we'd pull in all this data in our modules from like various other type of Terraform modules that people had run. But now when you hand this off to a new team, which, you know, has a lot has happened with in the last obviously couple of months, there's been a lot of churn in terms of existing teams and, you know, different members taking over different responsibilities. Comes to a point where it's like, if you hand somebody a piece of Terraform, can they read it? Can they understand what's happening? Where's the line between your configuration tools, your infrastructure tools? And I feel like the entire field is maturing in that sense in terms of learning the strength of certain tools and when not to use them, even if they might be capable of it. Like, is it meant for that particular task? So I think that's been something that we've definitely embraced in 2020. And we've seen, like, you know, a lot of people have been kind of forced into that route where they may have been transitioning already into DevOps, but now they've really questioned, like, okay, what value have they been getting out of that, and have they been going the right way with that in terms of just, you know, blanket covering all of their infrastructure and all of their applications with various tools, are like really trying to come out with patterns and trying to make this repeatable and communicating with the community at large.
Great point.
It kind of makes me back off my previous statement because, well, to some degree, right? Because if you throw yourself into it, you're probably not going to use it perfectly, right, the first time, and sort of it's a learning experience. But part of me always wishes I could go back a few years and call up Matt Rock on the phone and say, hey, you know, you've been doing this longer than I have. You know, what do you think before I dive too deep down this path, right? And so a lot of it is the nuance and context around how you use the tools, not so much. I find like everyone I encounter in this space can use the chefs, they can use the Terraform, they can do something with these tools, right? But it's often the context and the nuance around how to use them correctly and in a scalable and sustainable way, collaborative way. And I feel like as the years stack up in DevOps experience, you're more and more capable of forming opinions on this is the right way you should use these things. And I'll always think I'm doing things wrong, but as the years go by, maybe I'm doing them slightly better day by day. So
that's interesting. Yeah, well, like I just dropped in the poll for those that haven't seen it yet, and like over 50% kind of echoed something that you guys just all referred to, which is organizational silos, having challenges getting the right people to operate those things and the skills built to do it, and then difficulty integrating. So like you're at least aligned with 50% of our audience in terms of their perspective, what you guys just shared. It's a good job.
Yeah, it's funny how much time we burn on the strategy and not the tool itself, right? So Suraj and I, we work closely on a lot of things, and we're very rarely debating you know, whether we've written this cookbook the right way. It's more about how are we deploying it and how are we doing all of the bells and whistles around getting that thing to run. And that's often much less documented than actually writing the resources, right? Because it's difficult and there's different use cases for everybody.
I want to drop in one of the audience questions here that kind of builds on this, unless other people have other things to contribute, but maybe it will help draw it out. One question we got was, many junior DevOps folks are drawn to simplicity and solutions, that offer immediate results without having to deploy and maintain. I think that's change management infrastructure. How would you recommend introducing Chef to junior staff so that they can quickly be successful in contributing code and minimizing risk with infrastructure changes? It's a very well thought question.
Yeah. I think like going back to, you're right that this totally ties into this last question, because I think going back to everybody's answers, if you start by identifying a pipeline and the process that someone can contribute to Chef, then it will be really easy for them to just step into that role and go, oh, well, now all I need to learn is like what resources I want to use, or what resources I want to create, or what have you. They can focus on like the exciting stuff, and then you can say like, none of this goes into production unless it's gone through the pipeline that everything else goes through. So yeah, like defining that process is where you should probably spend more of your time than like building a super special learning path for like junior Chef developers, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think I want to kind of add on to that. I think that concept of the young junior developer just eager to kind of learn something new and bright, like that's a part of me that maybe is fading away as I get older, right? It's something that you do admire in the people who are younger, and so you don't want to shut it down by any means, right? You don't want to kind of pigeonhole them. You actually want to collectively grow together, and so you can leverage some of that out of your juniors who have that kind of just innate passion, and maybe it's a little bit of just jumping at attention, but as they bring things together, you're kind of educating them to meet with all the kind of reality that comes behind it. I think that those are very powerful, but you don't want to be restrictive, as kind of you were mentioning, Jody. You want to you foster it, I think, is a really, really good objective with that.
Yeah, like Jody mentioned too. So if you can give a safe way for new people to get onboarded and quickly work, because I mean, this is your business. These applications are too critical to always move fast. If you're moving fast and dangerously, that's a failed project. So you want to be able to give them those safe guardrails where they can get in. They don't have to understand all the safety of all the tools. Like you've already done that for them. They just have a README. They get to work. A lot of times with customers I work with, they'll just have like a wiki page they send developers to, and then they're like frustrated that developers can't figure it out. That's probably not enough. But give them some guidelines and training. There's like demo days and different like Slack channels. There's different ways you can get people engaged and give them a safe way to work. There's also easy. If it's so simple but doesn't meet your business need, then that's not a good thing either. So your business is probably complex, so you'll probably have a more complex thing, but you can still just expose the minimum to those new developers and get them contributing quickly.
Yeah, I'd also say that it's not totally, like I wouldn't totally discount that scrappiness, that spirit of scrappiness as well. So first of all, like I think it's totally natural to like, how do I fix this thing with the simplest, using the simplest means possible. Oh my God, there's Chef and these Habitat, these other tools over here, they look confusing. At the base of all of these things, no matter what tool you use, it's learning how to automate things. It's learning how to like script, improving you're gonna make everything better by understanding Bash and PowerShell more. So like if there was like one thing that I could tell a junior developer to do, like today, it's learn those skills the most, because you're gonna use those skills in every single tool you use, and the better your skills are in those simplest, most basic skills, the better you're gonna be able to deploy the more the tools that make DevOps more scalable. So definitely always strive to keep it simple, and always look at improving those very, very base, scrappy skills.
Yeah, to put, I guess, a bit of a more technical spin on the question, I know it was mentioned configuration management infrastructure. So in the context of Chef, you're thinking of things like a Chef server. And so I think it's important to know that you don't need a production scaled chef server to start exploring these things, right? Local development tools are super important when you're first starting to learn about these things. We use a lot of Vagrant, a lot of Docker, and so you often can validate things. And this is a very big point of the way Chef designs their tools is they allow you to sort of evaluate production grade pipelines very far left in the development cycle on your own laptop, right? So it's often easy to get caught up in, I want to play around with Chef server and start by making sure you have a production server deployed to AWS and things like that. But often it's not the case. Often you can do a lot of the legwork and discovery process just on that junior dev's local laptop. So.
Yeah, like I just to echo that, I've definitely seen some projects, fail or get encounter a lot of blockages by trying to cut off too much too soon. Like, oh my God, this is great. These tools are awesome. I'm going to automate everything. That's like our number one initiative is we're going to do everything. And then you kind of get stuck because that's really hard. Not that it's not important, but yeah, but starting, I would definitely stress, start small, start simple, and then grow up from there.
I think my comment on this is going to be a little interesting because I want to marry some of the ideas that I've heard here, but it's also a little conflicting. I think the starting small and starting simple is a really big thing, but I really want to combine, I think what Jody and Eric said at first, because there was a bit about the pipeline, but there was also the fact that like you do need the guardrails. I think a really important thing is that you shouldn't have a junior working on all this code that like, you don't also want to like, to kind of echo what Ryan was saying, you want to shift it left. You want them to be able to use Chef on their local machine, but you don't want them to start using Chef and then kind of like the cookbook blows up. Like it does everything, but it never sees prod until like it's so late that you're like, okay, well, we need like a massive effort to be able to test this automatically or whatnot. You want to be able to bootstrap them very quickly locally. You want them to be able to make small changes, and you want them to see the flow through the pipeline. Like understand what does it look like in the real world to now deploy that, all the way to prod to the point where you're making those small changes, but now expanding that to be able to do the things that are of value to you. And I think that comes back a bit to the PowerShell and the Bash bit as well. It's a breadth versus like depth kind of thing, because once you see the full picture, once you go all the way to prod, you're considering, okay, what actually adds value? Like you could add a resource to, substring some certain things and automate like, the name of your host, very small things. Or you could, also see that like maybe there's certain other holes that you want to fix at, maybe it's not even the configuration management that you want to focus on when you're moving to prod. Maybe your application is actually missing certain things. And I think it's important to get that whole picture, especially for juniors. So I think defining that pipeline from the get-go, having those guardrails in place, starting very simply, but moving quickly enough that they understand that full picture before they kind of dive too deeply into a certain kind of section, I think is super important.
Well, so we did get one question just in the chat, and I think it kind of relates to this, but also with people probably pursuing new skill sets into higher demand fields like DevSecOps, which is still really building in high demand people. One of the questions we got in the chat is like advice or guidance you would give for somebody that wants to transition into a DevSecOps role without having the 5 years of necessary experience. Like what would the first two things each of you would say to get started? It sounds like some of that is just learning locally and starting to develop on the fly in non-production environments. Others is obviously learning coding language, but maybe some of the guidance you would have for people here that might be considering a career switch or want to try something new and get into, the bleeding edge of DevSecOps.
I did that not too long ago. It's been now, I think 3 years. So I was the sort of traditional Windows systems administrator, and luckily enough, the company I was working for decided they had an interest in DevOps, and it kind of just became a natural transition as we got more and more involved in the cloud, specifically AWS and things like that. But I think this works well with Matt's comment about sort of understanding your fundamentals, because as a systems administrator, I was doing some Bash, I was doing some PowerShell, I don't know any, even to this day, I don't know any sort of full-fledged programming languages that goes, the Java, the Ruby, that sort of thing. So, but I surprised myself in how much I was actually able to contribute, despite not having sort of formal education or background in those things. And I think what I tend to survive on is just general problem solving and solutioning, right? There's really, at the end of the day, not a lot of substitute for that. And I think people often sell themselves short on their soft skills, right? They get hung up on the fact that they don't know a programming language. And my brain has been through that cycle many, many times, but I'm still here. I'm still contributing. And the way the world's going, especially in terms of infrastructure as code and these major clouds, a lot of that traditional sysadmin knowledge that I had is still relevant today. And it often doesn't take a lot to tie it all together. And it could just be, you know, the basic ability to write some bash and PowerShell. So it's very easy to think too far ahead, but you can often just fall back on your basic problem solving and solutioning. That's how I would put it.
Yeah, I think it piggybacks on a lot of what Matt said as well. Like having those fundamentals, as well as not trying to solve the whole world's problems. You know, starting small, starting with something that is tangential to what you're already doing to get that kind of that first taste. And again, so, you know, making sure you have those rock solid fundamentals, because when you just jump kind of too deep into one end and the fundamentals aren't there, it makes, you know, things get out of hand and makes a mess really, really quickly. The other thing that I'd add on to this is the fact that sometimes job postings are a little unfair, and have a little bit of confidence, because I saw one the other day about Kubernetes experience. You know, you need 12 years and it's been out for 6. So it's just, you know, that's kind of invalid. And so have a little bit of understanding when job descriptions are put together. They may not always have the full intent that you have to meet every single checkbox on there for requirements. So anything that you can show and tell and you know, give the experience that you do have, whatever that may be, is important to share, whether it's in an interview or in your portfolio or wherever. So I do want to add those kind of pieces as well.
Yeah, I'll add one quick bit as well, is like a lot of these tools, Jeff being one of them, they're marketed for practicality, right? They don't want to inhibit people coming from you know, non-programming backgrounds from getting involved with them, right? And so a lot of the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis don't really have a lot of prerequisite when it comes to sort of deep understanding of a particular language and things of that nature. So yeah, don't feel like you need to get PhDs in all these subjects before you can start trying to do these things.
Yeah, I think organizations are taking chances on people that show high propensity to learn and advance themselves and develop, to multiple points made here around your soft skills and your interest and your desire to learn these new things. And you just maybe have to find sometimes the company that's going to take a little bit of a, you know, jump on what your capabilities are on, and know that they can teach you some of the more technical fundamental stuff, and that you have a propensity towards that. So don't be afraid of reaching out to those companies and trying for it, because the reality is it's really hard to find these people with skills just like out of the box at birth. So like, I mean, a lot of companies are investing time, and, you know, you should check out companies like Chef if you're interested in learning about DevOps. Learn.chef.io is an example. Takes you all the way through things from like the fundamentals of core DevOps, all the way through learning pathways that will give you like deep technical and coding expertise through to be able to write your own code in those tools. So, you know, there's a lot to be learned. And then, you know, on the ShuttleOps side, we have a different approach, which kind of back ends and teaches you how maybe code and build and deploy processes work, but from the other direction, where we give you a user interface and sort of teach you how to interact with the core fundamentals of a pipeline that way. So, you know, there's multiple ways of sort of approaching this, you know, and sort of trying it out. So I think those were great answers. I want to talk a little bit about security. I know it's important to all of us, security and compliance. Sometimes those words get interchanged, you know, one meaning one. I have a clear definition in my head, but I'm sure everybody else has a very unclear definition on their end. But, you know, a lot of the conversation during COVID in 2020 has been around like efficiency and doing more with less, and even to some degrees increasing speed to market, which in our survey was one of the top drivers of pursuing a DevSecOps strategy. But I heard, I can't remember who said it, but running things dangerously or whatever, I think it was you, Eric, if you're running too fast a process in a dangerous way, you can open yourself up to a bunch of business pressures that maybe weren't there before. So maybe like talk a little bit about the importance of security and compliance as part of both DevSecOps, application development, the operational processes of getting those things to the cloud, infrastructure. There's tons of wrapped around that topic. So I'm curious what thoughts people have around security, because we did get several questions about that prior to the session. So I'm curious people would give us some thoughts on security and compliance. No one first.
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, that's a great one. And it's overwhelming, right? There's so many different areas you can start in. Like, you have to be secure, you have to be fast, you have to be efficient. So you can't always be like the best in all these areas. So certainly like pick your battles and figure out where's hurting you the most. Like, a lot of times folks may be spending tens of thousands of hours on an audit, and maybe that's time we can save for you. Or maybe you're a highly regulated industry, which is most of my customers. And so this, not only is it daunting just from the people perspective, and those are hours you're spending like manually logging into servers and checking status that could be spent like helping your business, but also your business may be regulatory in nature. And if you aren't passing your regulations, you may be like risking losing that business or losing that customer contract. So it could be really, really burdensome. I think if you understand how you can take these practices, like this as code practice, or this model of automating things, and then apply that to compliance, just like you would have applied it to your applications or applied it to config management, then you can make some serious inroads in that. We've seen customers with tremendous progress, right? It did take us 20,000 hours and now it takes us 2 or things like that. So, but learning that discipline, learning how you can apply things as code and automate things, and then just finding new problems you can apply that discipline to is what I'd recommend. And security and compliance, I think there's different things. They may overlap to some extent. If you can't ship your app, you probably aren't very secure. If you're on a 5-year-old version of Ruby, you're probably not very secure. So you probably need to be able to move fast to also be secure, and you probably need to move fast to be compliant as well.
Good one.
I think one of the things that I kind of want to repeat that really does apply to security as well, because I think Eric mentioned a lot about like compliance there. And I think one of the interesting things that he mentioned is that you kind of have to move fast. And I think an important part about that is that you have to start small. Like, don't boil the ocean your first go, but start small, learn how the process works. Because, for example, what does a security update look like for your application, for your operating system? Figure out what that process would look like and actually practice it. Because I think a lot of the bigger solutions essentially comes down to how can you effectively deploy this? How can you actually, like, you can solution something all day, you can write a cookbook that solves all your problems, but can you actually get that out safely? Do you actually have that process? And I think it's the same principles. It's being able to start small, having those pipelines already set up, being able to do things in an automated fashion, and understanding really what that would look like, and making all of your teams or members familiar with that.
The other thing I would add is the willingness to commit, time and resources to these things. I think, not only just in terms of security and compliance, but just the entire DevOps spectrum. One of the big issues that I've seen in my career, and see in other organizations, is we've got to get these features out. We've got to get these features out. We don't have time for to automate that today. There are times when you are in a crunch and you've got to focus in and get that thing done. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to commit somewhat significant resources to these areas, to security. For example, back in the day when I was doing a lot of database work, we needed to be able to commit time to not only doing our backups, to spend some time restoring our backups to make sure that our backups could be restored, because the backup's no good if you can't restore it. And you know what? That all takes time. being able to, test the patches and making sure that all, that your infrastructure still works with the patch applied, that all takes significant time. And sometimes, it's hard to invest that time, but at the end, a lot of it comes down to just that, letting your people, investigate these areas of knowledge and giving them the time to devote to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's funny as well how close in process security and compliance can be to sort of more common practices of automating OS builds or automating application builds, right? At the end of the day, you can take the approach as sort of building your security and compliance as a distributable artifact, right? And that's kind of the approach that Chef takes to those things. And it's often, I think, viewed separately to application builds and operating system builds. But when you really get into it, you find a lot of it's the same. And so you might be able to take a lot of your current practices that you might use for automating the build of your application and apply the exact sort of similar workflows to how you go about security and compliance. And once you start thinking about it that way, to me at least, it feels less daunting to approach it. So yeah, I found that interesting as I got deeper and deeper into Chef.
Yeah, you actually, Ryan, like inadvertently asked a question that we just got, which is, and I think everybody here will love this question, but should security be a concern throughout the entire DevOps lifecycle, or only a concern after deployment? And I think everybody will resoundingly agree on the answer here, but let's just see what the answers are. So, Jody, you unmuted fastest. I think next time we should have buzzers for everybody. And like I can, like buzz in first and win a prize.
Maybe like the screen can light up around whoever.
yeah, like the virtual game shows.
I was just gonna say yes. The answer is yes. Definitely security, like exactly what Ryan was just saying. Security should be thought of as in the same way that you're thinking about your application development and your infrastructure automation. Like all the code that goes through your pipeline should go through the same way or as close to the same way as possible, and go through all those guards and gates and all that stuff. And putting security at the beginning of that means that you don't have those deployments where you're like, ooh, let's get this out there. And then a week later, someone notifies you that you have shipped something with a huge security vulnerability, and you've just now spent a week with that in production. Like that is not an ideal situation. The analogy that I have always loved using is like, if there's an ambulance, if there's a cliff and people are like, hey, I'm gonna go run off this cliff, instead of putting an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff to collect the people who have injured themselves, put something at the top of the cliff to stop them jumping off. Like maybe hand them parachutes or something. If they wanna jump off the cliff, let them, but like move that security portion to the beginning of the process so that you don't have those sort of incidents in production anyway.
You just made me want to watch the movie Thelma and Louise.
I've never heard that analogy before, but I think it's awesome, and I think it represents also one other aspect to it, is that by doing something earlier on, you're probably doing something a lot easier than if you're waiting until the end and then having to kind of wedge stuff in. So it's absolutely like, you give them a parachute, put a sign up, say don't jump, right? Like there's a lot simpler things to do when everything's active, an active process part of your mind kind of thing. Yeah. So no, that's great. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, to me, like it falls into the same category as code defects. And I know, there's been lots of studies, that show that, the sooner you catch and fix a code defect, you know, it's going to be significantly cheaper to remediate than if you catch it, you know, further down the pipeline.
Yeah, the line I'll draw too, though, is so I work with a ton of like financial institutions who are very security conscious, and they will like lock down their developers' laptops to the extent where their developers can't work. And I don't consider that to be security. Your adversaries can move fast, like the hackers have automated everything. And if you aren't able to also move at that speed, that's actually like hurting your security posture. If your developer can't test and write the security patch, then how are you going to be faster than the hacker who like is exploiting a 0-day? So definitely needs to be in all your processes, but it can't just be something that like, you might as well just like shut down if you can't let your people work. What's the point of paying for an FTE if they can't use their laptop?
We were, Donald and I were sharing horror stories the other day about security in the era of quantum computing and how that was just going to fundamentally change like the speed with which people have to respond, because like the vulnerabilities will be exploited even so much faster than maybe they already are. And that's just like, that's we could have a whole AMA probably on theory about that at some point. Anything else on security? I have another kind of topic I wanted to bring up, but any other thoughts on security and sort of security and compliance relative to DevOps that people think are interesting things or best practices? And we kind of heard some of them, but any other thoughts?
Honestly, I just kind of want to summarize by saying consistency in pipelines. If you can have the same, I think Ryan was mentioning that it doesn't necessarily have to look too different than when you're actually developing and pushing out an application. I think that's so true. Like once you have a pipeline, once you understand how it moves between environments, you can repeat that infinitely. And coupled with everything else that everybody else said, it's really how you get these, how you keep security, you know, as far left as possible. You consider it from the start, and also you can react very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything as code is the key there, I think.
Yeah.
So if you're still building golden Windows images and you're still logging into a virtual machine and configuring things the way you need them configured, and then capturing that image, maybe start looking at things like Packer or some of these OS build automation tools to help sort of streamline that process.
Okay. Anything else on security? I've seen entire sessions for hours go on about security and compliance, but I think we've summarized it fairly well, which is make sure it's part of your entire DevSecOps process. The more you can do earlier on, the easier it is to fix and address it later, and don't jump over a cliff, at least until you make sure that there's an ambulance at the bottom. Or just be ready for the outcomes of jumping off a cliff, because, you know, who knows?
Or maybe just don't jump off the cliff.
Or just don't jump off the cliff. But I mean, as the person who's skydived, I mean, you know, it doesn't sound exactly terrible. So there were a couple of questions that came in from the audience in advance in terms of both microservices, pros, cons of microservices, as well as, you know, at what layer, and this kind of dovetails back into the security question, at what layer you handle security relative to microservices. And so I don't know if you guys would like to expound a lot on that, because, you know, there's certainly some pros and cons, I think, probably more pros than cons, but thoughts on microservices and just kind of this new fangled architecture that people are trying to pursue, some more successfully than others.
Yeah, so like one thing I would say off the bat is, so microservices, you know, right, it's like the hot topic. It's been the hot topic probably for the last, you know, few years. And there's been some posts about this, but I think my personal experience has been, don't do microservices unless you really know that you need microservices, because here's the thing, microservices will make everything harder. And like, I just think that's something you have to, now it can be good, and it depends on your organization. But here's where I've seen problems. You've got a small team that's tackling a, a relatively, maybe not a small, but not a huge problem, but they think, oh, we're going to do everything microservices. It's going to be so awesome. And over time, they realize this isn't so awesome because they've got like all these different repos that they're trying to figure out, okay, I got to change in this repo. How does that affect, this repo over here? They're different repos. I got to build tooling to kind of synchronize things across these repos. I've got all these different pipelines. And it just gets, I've got this bug and I've sharded my database, and what shard is this particular data, it all comes down to kind of like that micro optimization question. So what I would say is, start with a monolith. If you're in a position where you've got something simple, like get something working. And then as things begin to expand, as your team grows, as certain pieces of your architecture kind of take on a life of their own, and it makes sense to pull them out, into their own services, go for that. So yes, there is some initial expense in, kind of building the core of your microservices infrastructure that you have to think about. But bottom line is, I would say, really think long and hard about, is microservices the right thing for the scale of your problem?
Yeah, it also relies on a backbone of, I think, more automation and process orientation, because to your point, you have to keep all of this stuff, synchronized, aware of each other. Dependency mapping becomes even more important. There's just a ton of stuff that you have to think about that a lot of people are not far down the journey of necessarily doing for their existing monoliths. So, yeah.
I think an important point that he said there was that it's basically don't bite off more than you can chew. It's very much understanding where you are, the size of your team, and the scale of the pros to cons. Because an interesting thing I think with software development and DevOps, DevSecOps as well, based on that, is even though microservices might be what you could call an evolution of like a deployment process, the same way that containers could be considered an evolution of just running applications on servers. It's not that as soon as that was discovered, everybody should move to it. It has, there's a whole list of pros. The whole internet will go on about this, but they come at very high costs, and you have to really weigh those up because they scale worse the less mature your team is and the smaller your team is. Because if you're a Google, it makes sense that those marginal benefits for that high cost, because again, when you have that high value add, but it's a high cost, it's that marginal bit you're looking for, where when you can manage that, you have consistent patterns, it makes sense. When you're a small team, if you're now managing 10 applications, the actual size of your problem explodes almost exponentially. So an application doesn't need to be 10 different microservices with 10 different pipelines, where now you have to coordinate repos, you have to coordinate releases, this version doesn't work with this version. That problem size has just ballooned to the point where it's a management in and of itself, where when you're a large organization, when you've now matured your processes, it makes sense to go for that bit more value. But go for well-known, boring technology that is first, where the problem space is very well known. I think you only bite off those problems bite off those chunks of solution when you actually have those problems. Don't go for it because it's the fad. Because then you're going to be wasting what is going to be valuable resources trying to make that work for a problem that you don't even have yet. And I think the big thing is, like he said, make it work. That is such a big deal. Make it work well, understand where you're actually going to get the value. It's not necessarily going to be by chasing everybody else that's already grown to scale where they have those problems.
And maybe once it's working so well and you notice all of your developers are sitting there twiddling their thumbs because everything's going so well, then maybe start thinking about, how could we maybe break this monolith up a bit, and what would the advantages of that be? And all of a sudden you find you have the time to do that because things are running so smoothly. I think I'd agree.
You certainly want to let the demands of your business dictate what technologies you choose. And if you have a business demand that is like a monolith that's unacceptable for, that's a great time to look at all other options. Those other options, though, don't remove any of the other disciplines you need to have. You have to be a compliant organization. Microservices don't change that. You have to be secure, you have to be fast. You have to ship software well, like really all those processes. I think a lot of times we want to like jump to a new technology like the cloud or microservices, and you're like, I'm in the cloud, I don't need enterprise security anymore. It's like, no, those are, there's still vulnerabilities. It's still like critical to your business. And I just like the last reminder is like, use the right technology. Like your customer isn't going to judge you by, oh, you have the best chef implementation in the world. Like your customer wants to use your service and product, and it's how like your vendors and your technologies are serving those products is what matters.
Jason, was the original question, Bill, around security, or right, we're talking a lot about microservices and pros and cons, but was it?
It was
your refresher.
Microservices and pros, cons, and also like, does that change your security patterns relative to microservices? So that was kind of the additional pivot on that. But I think it doesn't. It just makes it maybe more complex, or still just as a dependency or a requirement that you have, as much as whether you have a monolith. Just kind of
I think
additional complexity.
Yeah, I think the complexity argument is still relevant in the security context, right? Because what was being once evaluated as just one single thing is now being evaluated at 5 or 6 different individual components, right? And you're gonna, over time, ownership is gonna develop over component A and component B, and you're gonna have this discourse between those owners about how those things relate to each other.
Well, and hopefully
evaluate everything individually.
Hopefully those hardcore organizational silos have been worked out by that point, so that as the ownership develops, you're not running up against people-based workflow issues and whatnot. So yeah. All right, we have a couple. Was there anything else on microservices? We got a couple more questions in the question window, so I can move on to those. Okay, so here's one that I think. Well, the first one is, do you think the future of security going forward is going to be more AI based?
Isn't everything?
Yeah.
I mean, that's my first thought. I'd imagine there's just because of how hot a topic security is, that might be, leading the wave. But personally, I haven't had a lot of interaction with that or the idea of that. So I don't know if anyone else has.
I think it's an interesting question, because definitely when it comes to stuff like threat detection or intrusion kind of stuff, we've already seen that in the space for quite some time. But I think with what we consider security as a whole, AI is helping kind of in certain cases, like what you'll see, and this is pretty cool on GitHub now, if you have repos that are checked into GitHub, and with certain types of technologies, you'll have like lock files or stuff, so they know which particular dependencies you're using. They'll be able to say, you have vulnerabilities here. And that's actually pretty nice to be able to like, have that level of automation. AI is kind of pushing that forward. And maybe we'll be able to do that in terms of even code analysis, static code analysis. When you check in those repos saying, okay, if you do it this particular way, like you might need to make sure that this is locked down. But I think at the application level, I don't know that AI is necessarily going to take over, because it seems like that space is kind of understood to the point where the problems we have are more about scaling the problems and being able to make them more reusable, transparent, while remaining secure. And I don't know that AI necessarily solves that. That's at least the big hurdle that I'm seeing for most organizations that we work with. But the cases that are meant to be tackled, and again, it's kind of those like vulnerability type cases, I think it already is happening.
Okay, one other question that we got from the audience. How do you approach implementing security in non-prod environments when ownership often is being shared and changing?
Am I allowed to answer patterns for everything or pipelines? Because I think that's actually, for us, we've noticed that to be the case. If you have like, for example, certain secrets, or you want to lock down certain access, they might be defined differently, but having the same pipelines to apply them, having the same kind of steps to verify that is something that's helped us a lot. So it's almost like the requirements might change, but the approach is consistent, which I think is important. Like being able to understand like where those security like rules coming from, where they actually applied, et cetera, et cetera. That's a small answer to that.
I think part of it too that needs to be considered is probably the personnel, like the bringing teams together, because if you have kind of this siloed sense of it where your security team is essentially only caring about production, well, you've lost the battle a little bit already. You need to be involved. You need to get that buy-in from all teams involved at all stages. You can't, just the same way you can't have developers not care as much about production. You know, the old excuse, well, it works on my laptop. That doesn't fly, right? You need to bring everybody together. They all need to be kind of on the same page from start to finish in the whole process and the whole pipeline.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I think my silver bullet for this is automate and codify your security policies, and then it's super easy to put them in any environment, non-prod or prod.
Yeah, like Jody said, if you have your policies in an actionable format, like a code format, you can apply your same policies on your developer laptop, dev, prod stage. I think another part of this question, though, which I think is the main benefit of actually doing these patterns or policies, automation has been around for like 20 years or longer. We've been able to automate stuff in some fashion. The real change, though, with this new wave of it is we can treat that policy as code, and we can version it, and we can apply this this pattern, as Siraj likes to keep saying. And what's so important about this pattern is version control is really the best sharing tool that's been made, that is out there, right? So you may have different organizations and they have different areas of responsibility. You can let the version control tools figure out those areas of responsibility. You can know, like, here is the code that equals secure, and these 5 different teams all have a hand in the pot. Well, like, let's use GitHub to do that. And GitHub, you can have really granular permissions. You can have people submit and approval, and it's just like a different level of control than you've ever had before. So like, let that tool worry about your silos, get all your silos on board and use the tool to do that. And that's where you get that like 10x improvement over just automating. Like, throw all those tools and be like, here's the repo. You all have problems and concerns, like use the repo to hash those problems and concerns out, and then let Chef or let the different automation tool just perform the automation task.
Okay, well,
it often comes down to, sorry, Jason, I'll just say one more thing, but it often just comes down to when you're trying to solution these things, think of how can I boil them down to only their inputs, right? So you shouldn't be thinking about production and development environments as separate entities, right? You've developed a solution with what production should be in mind, and it's almost a byproduct that you can now, create 3 other environments. You call them dev, stage, QA, whatever you want to call them. But really, as you're coming up with that solution, the thing you should be keeping in mind is, can I achieve this multiple environment structure by only manipulating the inputs I give to my process? And that's why I think pipelines is always the answer here. And that's a key thing about a pipeline. What inputs you give to the pipeline.
Okay, well, we have like final minute and a half, so we're gonna do the roundtable thing. Final words, 15 seconds or less. I'm starting my stopwatch. I'm gonna go in order. So Dave, it's over to you first.
Oh man, I didn't have a wrap up prepared, but no, I do want to thank everybody for taking the time here. Hopefully we lent some expertise, some understanding, some tips, something to look forward to. We're all more than available, if you want to reach out by any means. Really just appreciate your time and bring your teams together. That's what I want to really, that's my 15 seconds.
It's a good one. All right, Jody.
Pipelines. Really, I think the biggest thing is to start by developing a really strong pipeline that helps define how you deliver any stuff through your organization. And that's it.
And start small. It could be a pipeline that just outputs a hello world message, right? Start small, and then from that you can easily just build up and up.
Pipelines forever, no cliffs. All right, Siraj.
I was literally going to say what Jody said, but yeah, start with the code, define it, make it visible, do it consistently, understand how that works through the entire cycle. Don't boil the ocean from the get-go. Start small, get better at it. And thank you everybody for joining.
Eric.
You're muted.
Just thank you. I think Jody and Shiraz and Ryan hit the mark. So thank you.
All right, Ryan, you jumped in on Jody, but I'll let you have 5 more seconds.
I'll just say, it's putting myself in the audience's perspective. It's kind of, I might think to myself, well, we haven't been talking about specifics here, right? We haven't been talking about, it's easier said than done in a lot of cases. And I think reaching out for help, whether it's to chefs themselves or a company like ShuttleOps for help with these things is doesn't imply codependence, right? We're happy to have a conversation and consult on an as need basis to help get the ball rolling per se. And that's all I wanted to say.
Cool. Last but not least, Matt and his beach view, which is beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I could pile on to the whole pipeline thing. I mean, one thing that I found really helpful for me personally when I was starting off was whenever I started a new, I used to do a lot of open source stuff on my own. And whenever I would start up something new, the first thing I would do is get like my deployment automation, set up, get it, all versions controlled set up. And because I found that if I got that set up first, then everything else went faster. Of course, again, that kind of with the idea of not going too far with that so that you don't get the original open source thing done at all. But at any rate, yeah, I would just say, thanks everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure sharing and participating with everyone here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So with that, we'll give everybody back the rest of their day. We will be sharing this recording very shortly. So we hope to do more of these in the future. Thanks again for everybody's time. Have a great day. And we will speak with you all soon, hopefully. Bye.
Take care.